when a lone, frightened boy was discovered in the heart of a remote national forest. What looked, at first, like a simple rescue quickly twisted into something far darker, hinting at secrets too disturbing to remain hidden. This is a story of betrayal, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Before we dive in, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you believe the truth should always come to light, consider showing your support and subscribing for more stories that shine a light on courage and justice. Ryan Mercer had always loved the hush of the forest just before dawn. The moment when night was losing its grip and day was still in the wings felt like a sacred hush, almost like standing on a threshold between two worlds. On that particular morning, he had set out from his small camp deeper than usual into the national park. Despite being an experienced backpacker and survivalist, even he felt a prickling sense of caution hiking through terrain this isolated. The old-growth pines stretched tall, their branches webbed together into something akin to a cathedral ceiling. Shafts of early light slid through cracks in the canopy, revealing the glistening dew on ferns and wild mushrooms along the path. Ryan was a patient man in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered from years of hauling gear on his back. He had spent so many nights under the stars that the forest noises rarely startled him, yet that morning an uncommon stillness set him on edge. There were no bird calls greeting the sunrise, no chattering squirrels, no rustle of small creatures going about their pre-dawn routine. It was as though the entire forest held its breath. He paused, scanning the dark trunks around him. His footsteps crunched softly on the damp leaf litter, the only human sound in an otherwise silent world. Then he heard it, a faint sob, strangled, as if the one who made it was trying desperately not to be heard. Ryan halted mid-step, adrenaline spiking. He lifted a hand to his ear, heart hammering. The whimper came again, more of a gasped sob this time, muffled but definitely human. He turned sharply, trying to pinpoint the direction. Whatever the source, it was close, perhaps just beyond the dense patch of fallen trees. He carefully moved closer, stepping around a broad trunk that had toppled in some storm the previous year. What he saw made him freeze. A small boy, maybe 10 years old at most, crouched in the debris of rotted branches and pine needles. The child was barefoot, dirty, and trembling. His clothes were shredded in multiple places, streaked with mud and scratches. His dark hair hung limp across his forehead, plastered there by sweat or maybe tears. He looked up, seeing Ryan approach, and recoiled instantly as though expecting to be struck. "Hey," Ryan said softly, voice hoarse with concern. "Are you hurt?" The boy blinked, his wide eyes gleaming with tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed fully. Then came the words that would come to define Ryan's life for weeks, perhaps months, to come. "They left me out here." His voice cracked on the final word, as if the memory of it alone was too overwhelming. Ryan felt a chill swirl through him. He glanced over his shoulder. "Pourtre? Why would they leave a child in the middle of nowhere?" "It's okay," he said quietly, easing himself down to a crouch so he wouldn't loom so tall. "I'm not going to hurt you. I promise." The boy's eyes flickered through the trees, fearful that any second, some monstrous figure might appear. For a moment, Ryan wasn't sure if the kid would bolt. Then the boy whispered, "You're not one of them?" His voice had the hesitant hush of someone who had learned not to trust easily. "No," Ryan said firmly. "I'm just a backpacker." He took off his canteen from his belt, opened it slowly to show he meant no harm, and offered it out. "Drink." The boy hesitated. His expression said he was torn between dread and desperate thirst. Finally, with trembling hands, he accepted the canteen and took a few shaky sips. He coughed but seemed to appreciate the cool water. Ryan searched the boy's face for injuries. There were minor cuts and bruises, a thin scratch across his cheek that didn't seem fresh. But there was more damage lurking behind those terrified eyes. The boy had been through something far worse than a standard case of getting lost on a trail. Ryan gently rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "We need to get you somewhere safe," he said. "Let's head back to my camp. I've got some supplies, a spare pair of boots that might fit. Then we can get you to a ranger station." At the mention of leaving the spot, the child tensed up violently. He gripped Ryan's wrist so hard it hurt. "No," he hissed. We can't just walk out in the open. They'll see us. Ryan's stomach lurched. They'll see us, he repeated. Who is? But even as he asked the question, Ryan had the uncanny sensation of being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, and he felt a presence somewhere behind him. Instinctively, he rose to his feet, swiveling. His eyes combed the thick stands of pine, the dense undergrowth. He saw only shadows. For a moment he dismissed it as paranoia. Then, just as he turned back toward the boy, he caught the faintest flicker of movement among the trunks. A shape, a figure, impossible to make out in detail. Yet Ryan saw it sway, then vanish like a phantom into the gloom. His breath caught, and an icy chill spread through his limbs. Stay close, he murmured to the boy. Keep quiet. The boy stared up at him, eyes round. They're still watching, he said in a trembling whisper, as though he'd long since gotten used to this constant fear. Ryan nodded, his mind racing. He and the boy were deep in remote territory, miles from any established trail. It was at least an hour's hike back to his small campsite, and then another day's trek to the nearest ranger station. The thought of being pursued by unknown watchers in the woods filled him with an uneasy sense of dread. All right, Ryan whispered, scanning the silhouettes of the forest one more time. Come with me. We'll move quietly. If you see anything, hear anything, tell me. The boy nodded, clinging to Ryan's shirt as they set off. Ryan kept a constant watch behind them, but the forest had closed in again, silent as a tomb. Their footfalls seemed deafening in that hush, each crackle of a branch underfoot like a shot fired in the stillness. The sky lightened by slow increments, revealing the ancient tapestry of evergreen needles overhead. Yet that glimmer of morning brought little comfort. Ryan knew that if someone was out there, they had the advantage of cover and knowledge of the terrain. After a grueling hour of picking careful routes through the undergrowth, they reached Ryan's camp. The boy stood off to the side, hugging himself. His knees wobbled and he looked drained, physically, mentally, emotionally. Ryan rummaged through his tent for a spare pair of wool socks and an extra set of boots. They were too large for the kid, but it was better than going barefoot. He handed over a protein bar and a second canteen. Go ahead and eat. If you need more, let me know. The boy devoured the bar, taking only a few seconds to tear through it. Ryan watched carefully, noticing how the child's eyes kept sliding to the perimeter of the campsite, as if expecting someone to come charging in at any moment. Ryan's chest tightened. He thought about the figure he'd seen slip away among the trees. The question hammered at him. Who on earth would leave a child out here like this? As the boy wolfed down the bar, Ryan asked gently, "What's your name?" The boy swallowed. "Ethan," he said softly. "Ethan Calloway." Ryan frowned, repeating the surname in his head. It didn't sound familiar. "Ethan, do you know where you came from? How you got here?" Ethan paused, wavering as if choosing his words. "I ran away," he said, voice hoarse. "From the house. I didn't mean to get this far, but I got lost." His lips trembled. "I think that's why they left me. To see if I could find my way back." Ryan nodded slowly. He sensed a deep fear behind those words. "Who are they? Are they your parents? Other family?" Ethan's eyes flashed with something that looked almost like a primal terror. "No," he said. "They're not my family. They said they were, but they're not. They keep us there, He stopped talking abruptly and shuddered. Ryan frowned, quietly alarmed. "Keep you there? Like prisoners?" Ethan looked away and did not answer. Ryan's gut twisted. He realized that he might be dealing with a kidnapping or some form of abuse situation. Most likely, Ethan had been abducted or lured away from somewhere and ended up in the clutches of these unknown. This child's disorientation, bruises, and terror all suggested some grim story. "All right," he said finally, glancing toward the rustling leaves. "We need to get you out. There's a ranger station about a day's hike from here. We'll head there together. I'll keep you safe." Ethan looked at him with a flicker of hope. "You won't give me back to them?" Ryan shook his head firmly. "Not a chance." For a few moments, Ethan pressed his lips together as if trying to hold back a new wave of tears. Then he just nodded and sniffled. That brief moment of vulnerability told Ryan that the child had known so little kindness that even a simple gesture of reassurance was overwhelming. They broke camp quickly, Ryan moving with practiced efficiency. He stored his gear, strapped on his pack, and shouldered a second small bag that he'd let Ethan carry if needed. But the boy looked so frail and battered that Ryan wound up holding that too. As they headed off, Ethan stuck close, glancing nervously behind them. They followed the faint game trail Ryan had used to come in. The route wasn't easy. There were tangles of bramble and steep inclines, places where the pine needles formed slippery patches, and occasional hidden roots that could trip even an inexperienced hiker. But Ryan was used to forging paths through tough terrain, and he helped Ethan whenever the boy stumbled. It became clear within the first couple of miles that Ethan was in no shape for a full day's hike. He limped, complaining quietly about the pain in his feet, even though he was wearing boots now. His complexion was pale, drained from hunger and fear. Ryan decided they needed to pace themselves. He didn't want to risk injuring the boy further. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the canopy when they heard voices, human voices, drifting through the still air. Ryan placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, signaling to be quiet. Together, they crouched behind a thicket of mountain laurel. Through the dense greenery, Ryan saw two men passing along what appeared to be a narrow deer track. They each wore a dark jacket, though from a distance, it was hard to see any insignia. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. He and Ethan were concealed well enough, but if these men were searching for them, staying hidden was crucial. The boy recognized them immediately. Ryan felt Ethan seize up, clutching the sleeve of Ryan's coat with such force that his knuckles turned white. The men paused in the dappled sunlight, scanning the area. One of them pulled out a walkie-talkie and muttered something that Ryan couldn't make out. Then the pair moved on, continuing down the slope. When they were safely out of earshot, Ethan exhaled, trembling. "That's them," he mouthed silently. "We have to go." Ryan nodded. His chest pounded. He had never been one to shy away from a confrontation, but this was different. He had no idea who these men were. Kidnappers? Criminals? Part of something bigger? For now, it seemed best to maintain stealth. The forest was vast enough for them to circle around unseen. They spent the next hour navigating a more treacherous hillside, trying to avoid the route the men had taken. Ryan's heart sank as the terrain forced them to move more slowly. Every snap of a twig underfoot, every rustle of leaves, made them freeze to listen for approaching footsteps. But the men did not reappear. By the time early evening arrived, Ryan realized Ethan was fading. The boy's face was drawn and exhausted. Ryan decided to make a small, discreet camp for the night rather than push on. They found a hidden hollow at the base of a rocky outcrop, partially screened by a cluster of pines. Ryan started a tiny, smokeless fire using a pocket stove instead of gathering wood. He heated a bit of soup from his supplies, offering some to Ethan, who drank it silently. After a few minutes, Ethan looked at Ryan with fearful eyes. "Do you think they'll find us?" he asked in a small voice. Ryan exhaled slowly. "Not if we're careful," he replied. "Tomorrow, we'll get to the ranger station. Once the rangers and police know what's happened, they can protect you." Ethan nodded, but he still looked haunted. The flickering glow of the stove highlighted the bruises along his jaw. Ryan noted them, fighting a surge of anger. Whatever had happened to this child, it left marks far deeper than the physical ones. "I need you to trust me, Ethan," Ryan murmured, his voice low. "I'm not going to let them take you back. I promise." Ethan's eyes watered, but he didn't cry. He just sat there, hugging his knees. That night, they slept in shifts. Ryan took the first watch, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. He couldn't dismiss the possibility that the men were still hunting them. But the forest remained unervingly silent. By the break of dawn, Ethan was stirring, rubbing his tired eyes. Ryan gave him a bit of a protein shake from his supplies, a small but concentrated meal. Then they resumed their trek. Occasionally, they paused to check for fresh footprints. Ryan spotted some near a muddy patch of ground, boot prints, likely from the two men they'd seen. But they seemed to be heading in a different direction. Quiet relief filled Ryan as he realized they might have a clear path to the ranger station. The day dragged on, with the sun rising overhead, then sliding westward. At times, Ethan asked if they were almost there, and Ryan would reassure him they were making good progress. They had to cross a shallow stream at one point, and Ethan whimpered at the icy water stinging his battered feet. Ryan carried him across the worst part, arms straining but determined. After hours of trudging, they finally came upon a faint sign of civilization, a weathered wooden sign pointing to a ranger outpost another few miles ahead. They reached the outpost near dusk. It was a modest wooden structure with a small porch, a radio antenna, and a tattered flag. Ryan felt a profound wave of relief wash over him. He saw a light on inside and, leading Ethan carefully by the hand, approached the door. A uniformed ranger in his 50s answered, looking startled to see them so disheveled. "Good God," said the ranger, stepping aside. "Come in. What happened?" Ryan guided Ethan inside, explaining quickly that the boy had been abandoned out in the forest and was in dire need of help. The ranger, whose name tag read Bennett, looked alarmed, yet calm in that professional way that men of his trade cultivate. He immediately radioed the nearest station, requesting a medical unit and contacting local law enforcement. Then he asked Ethan a few basic questions: name, age, where he came from. Ethan, anxious and withdrawn, clung to Ryan's side, answering softly, "Ethan Calloway." He repeated the line about being left behind. Ranger Bennett frowned, tapping his pen against a notepad. "Calloway, name rings a bell. Let me just check something." He turned to rummage through a worn filing cabinet in the corner. A wave of relief swept over Ryan. Finally, official help. Ethan would be safe now, or at least safer than he'd been for who knows how long. He helped the boy sit down at a small table, offering more water. The kid looked exhausted beyond words. Eventually, 2 police officers arrived in a dusty SUV, along with a medic. The medic checked Ethan's vitals: mild dehydration, some scrapes, bruises, but nothing life-threatening. Still, the boy was shaky, and his eyes darted around the station as if expecting some hidden threat to leap out at any moment. One of the officers, a tall woman with sharp, discerning eyes, introduced herself as Detective Naomi Archer. She wore civilian clothing rather than a standard uniform, and something in her brisk manner said she was used to dealing with sensitive cases. She approached Ethan carefully, kneeling so as not to tower over him. "Hey, Ethan," she said, her tone calm and warm. "My name is Naomi. Can you tell me how you ended up out there?" Ethan shrank back, glancing at Ryan as though for reassurance. Ryan spoke quietly. "He's been through a lot. Might need some time." He cast Naomi a meaningful look that said, "He'll talk when he's ready." Naomi nodded understandingly. "No rush," she said. She rose and turned to Ranger Bennett. "Do we have any record of a missing Ethan Calloway on file?" Bennett shook his head. "I was looking. Nothing current. Maybe the name was in some older reports." He busied himself at the desk again. Meanwhile, the second officer, a stocky man named Pike, stepped up with a concerned expression. "We'll do a quick search for missing persons in the national database," Pike said. "If the name's correct, something should pop up." He began tapping into a laptop they'd brought. Naomi pulled Ryan aside gently. "He told you he was running from someone? A group?" Ryan nodded grimly. "He mentioned the house, some place that keeps kids. He was terrified. I saw at least 2 men in the forest. They might still be looking for him." Naomi's brow furrowed with deep concern. "All right, let's get him somewhere safe. Once we confirm who he is, we'll open a full investigation. We may need your statement too." Ryan agreed, relieved to have law enforcement on board. As the flurry of activity continued, the sun sank behind the trees outside. Ethan ended up dozing off in a chair, physically and mentally spent. Naomi, Bennett, and Pike compared notes. At one point, Pike's laptop beeped. He stared at the screen. "We might have something," he murmured. Naomi and Bennett gathered around. Ryan joined, glancing at the screen. At first, the details were sparse, an old missing child case from 2 years ago. Then the name, Ethan Calloway, presumed deceased. The final lines read that the child was officially declared dead after all leads ran cold. A hush fell around the group. Ryan stared, feeling like the floor had just tilted. What? That's impossible. He's right there, sleeping. Naomi's jaw clenched. So the official record says. The case must have been closed. She tapped the screen. We need the full file. There might be more to it, like why he was declared dead if no remains were found. She glanced at Ethan, who slept fitfully in the chair. This changes everything. If he was presumed dead, that means no one's been looking for him. Ryan felt a surge of protective anger. No one was looking for him, he repeated, as though the words tasted bitter. My God. Naomi placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice grim. We'll find out who's behind this. They decided to keep Ethan overnight at the local hospital for a proper checkup. Ryan was allowed to accompany him, as the boy had clung to him so desperately that it would have been cruel to separate them. Detective Archer drove them, her expression tight with anger and resolve. The local hospital was small but clean, the corridors lined with that typical pale green paint. A nurse led Ethan into an examination room. Ryan waited outside the door until the boy insisted that Ryan come in with him, so Ryan did, standing near the corner while the nurse gently cleaned Ethan's scrapes and dressed the more serious ones. Ethan tolerated it stoically, wincing a few times but never crying out. Ryan realized with a knot in his stomach that this was likely far from the worst physical pain Ethan had experienced. Eventually, the nurse stepped out to let the doctor run some final checks. Ryan placed a hand on Ethan's arm. You're safe now, he whispered. They can't get in here. Ethan nodded. For a moment, his guard dropped, revealing the frightened child he truly was. I don't want to go back, he whispered. You won't, Ryan promised. I'll do whatever it takes. The next morning, Detective Archer returned with news. There really had been an Ethan Calloway listed in a missing child report from 2 years prior, but the record indicated that the search ended with no resolution and the child was declared legally dead under uncertain circumstances. Naomi told Ryan that local authorities wanted to interview Ethan carefully to gather evidence for a possible kidnapping and abuse case. They also intended to launch a search in the part of the forest where Ryan had found him to look for signs of these people from the house. When Naomi gently brought this up to Ethan, the boy trembled but agreed, saying in a small voice, There are more kids. I know there are. His eyes flickered with fear at the memory. They teach us to hide and run, so nobody finds us. But if you don't do what they want, they leave you in the woods. Ryan felt a wrench in his chest. All along, he had suspected something terrible, but hearing Ethan articulate it hurt in a way he couldn't quite describe. Naomi tried to keep her voice calm. Do you remember where the house is located, Ethan? It's in the forest, he said. But I don't know where. They move us sometimes. He swallowed. I ran away a couple of nights ago. I got lost. Naomi nodded, sympathetic. Could you show us anything that might help us find it? Ethan hesitated, as though fearful that giving away such information would unleash dire consequences. I think so, he said haltingly. But it's mostly just trees. That day, Ryan, Detective Archer, and 2 more officers traveled by helicopter to do an aerial reconnaissance of the area near where Ryan had found Ethan. The pilot circled the thick expanse of pines, searching for any sign of clearing or structures. But the canopy was dense, and if there was a compound or building hidden beneath it, it wasn't easily visible from the sky. They landed back at the local airfield, somewhat discouraged. Naomi pressed on, working with the local police to organize a ground search. Ryan volunteered to help. Over the next week, they combed the forest in small teams, using the rough coordinates of where Ryan had stumbled onto Ethan. The teams advanced methodically, scanning for footprints, campsites, or man-made objects. They found old bits of rope, an abandoned campsite, and suspicious items that might or might not have been related to Ethan's captors. Yet nothing definitive pointed to the location of a hidden house. During that time, Ethan remained under protective watch at a foster home run by a kind older woman named Gloria. He was deeply distrustful of strangers, so Ryan spent considerable hours visiting, hoping to make him feel safe. Detective Archer also came by, speaking softly with him about anything he remembered, the layout of rooms, the faces of the people there, any unique landmarks near the property. Slowly, fragments emerged. Ethan described a large cabin with boarded-up windows, a cellar door that led underground, a place where they kept old notebooks full of lessons. He said it was always cold, even when it was warm outside. The children were told that the outside world was full of evil, that strangers wanted to hurt them or turn them into criminals, so they had to stay hidden in the house to survive. They had strange classes every day, memorizing words that Ethan didn't understand. And when children disobeyed, they were dragged outside and left in the forest as punishment, a cruel test of survival. All of this spurred Naomi and her colleagues to intensify their search. Days stretched on, turning into nearly 2 weeks, with no major break. Ryan started to worry that the captors had fled. Then, near the end of that second week, a break finally came. A pair of hikers reported seeing suspicious activity in a seldom explored corner of the park, shadows moving near an old logging trail, flashes of light at night as if from flashlights. The hikers also mentioned stumbling onto a small structure half buried in the brush. They didn't investigate deeply, feeling uneasy. They left and reported it to the rangers. Ryan, Naomi, and a group of officers immediately planned a search operation. At dawn the next day, they set out with 2 four-wheel-drive vehicles, driving as far as they could before the trail became impassable. Then they continued on foot. The forest in this region was older and even more remote, towering hemlocks, thick moss, and fallen logs that created a chaotic labyrinth. The group moved carefully, rifles and sidearms at the ready in case they encountered armed resistance. Late in the morning, they stumbled upon a narrow path that seemed almost artificially concealed by branches, as though someone had deliberately obscured it. Following it, they soon found fresh boot prints. Naomi stooped down, pressing a hand to the ground. "These prints can't be more than a day old," she muttered. She looked at Ryan and the officers. "We're close." The trail led them to a rundown cabin that matched part of Ethan's description. It was cunningly hidden behind a cluster of boulders and trees. From a distance, it might look like a collapsed shed. Up close, it bore the signs of recent use: footprints, drag marks, a small pile of ashes from a makeshift fire pit. The windows were boarded. The door was locked. One of the officers tried the handle, but it was secured from inside. With a few swift strikes, they forced the door. The interior was dark and stank of stale air. Ryan switched on a flashlight. He glimpsed multiple cots with rumpled blankets, open tins of food, and an ancient wood stove. There was nobody inside now, but the presence of half-eaten meals suggested they had been there recently. Naomi discovered a locked closet at the back of the cabin. One of the officers used a crowbar. The door splintered open, revealing shelves packed with notebooks, scrap paper, and typed documents in battered folders. There was a musty odor, like old paper left to decay in the damp. Ryan picked up one notebook, flipping through pages scrawled with words and phrases that looked like some twisted curriculum. Lessons on survival, evasion, obedience. Some sections included bizarre ideological rants about how the world was corrupted and only certain children could be saved. On a small wooden table, they found a list of names. Handwritten columns with checkmarks, some lines crossed out. Ryan's heart thudded as he scanned the list, a half-dozen names, including Ethan C. Next to it was a line, tested to left, that was scratched through. Then Ryan's eyes caught sight of another name that wasn't crossed out, Rosie H., circled in red. He pointed to it, turning to Naomi. "This means there's another child they might have taken." Naomi's expression hardened. "We need to find these people, and we need to find Rosie H., if she's still out there." She bagged up the notebooks and lists as evidence. As they were leaving, Naomi spotted fresh tire tracks behind the cabin leading deeper into the forest. It was a single-lane dirt path that vanished around a bend. The group followed it on foot until it ended at a clearing large enough to serve as a makeshift parking area. From there, the forest loomed in all directions, trackless again. It was time for the FBI. Naomi made the call that evening, presenting the evidence: probable interstate kidnapping, evidence of multiple abducted children, potential child endangerment on a large scale. The story had ballooned beyond a local matter. Soon enough, FBI agents arrived, quietly setting up a command post near the outskirts of the forest. They questioned Ethan more gently, aided by trauma specialists who knew how to handle a child with such a harrowing background. Slowly, details emerged about a bigger network. There was something beyond just one cabin, beyond a single group of criminals. Ethan recalled references to a farmhouse, or a main house, where the leaders lived and trained the children. No one except select overseers ever traveled to a nearby town, and the children rarely saw more than the interior of that hidden property. They were told the outside world was evil, that the only safe place was with the family. If they disobeyed, they were punished or left to fend for themselves in the wilderness. Night after night, Ryan found it hard to sleep. He was plagued by nightmares about Ethan alone in the dark, or some unknown child, Rosie, lost in the forest. Guilt gnawed at him for not finding them sooner, but Naomi assured him he had done more than anyone else. He had saved Ethan. He was the reason the whole twisted operation was coming to light. Time passed, and one day, Naomi showed up at Ryan's door, her expression guarded. "We think we've found a lead," she said. She explained that the FBI had tracked vehicle registrations linked to an alleged private school in the region. The addresses were all fake, but the vehicles were traced to a shell organization. One particular route was used regularly by a set of vans. They had been seen by traffic cameras only at odd hours, traveling a highway that skirted the national park. Agents suspected these vans shuttled supplies, or people, back and forth. Ryan felt both dread and relief. "So you know where they're going?" Naomi nodded. "We're close. We suspect there's a compound deep in the woods. The cabin we found was probably an outpost or a satellite location. The real center of operations is bigger. We're going in soon." Soon turned out to be a careful operation that took another week to finalize. Ryan asked to be involved. Initially, the FBI refused. He was a civilian, not law enforcement. But Naomi made a case that Ryan's knowledge of the forest and his personal stake might be beneficial. In the end, the FBI included him on the search and rescue portion, not the official raid. They planned a two-pronged approach. One team would approach from the forest side, another from the nearest county road, to box the suspects in. Ryan found himself in the back of an FBI SUV before dawn, traveling with Naomi and a handful of agents to a rendezvous point near the suspected compound's perimeter. Anxiety gnawed at him. He thought about Ethan, who was still in foster care but improving daily. The boy had nightmares, but he was no longer alone. He had Ryan's phone number memorized and would call him late at night, just to say a few words before bed. Ryan knew that rescue operations like this could be dangerous, that the cult or group might react violently. They arrived at a secluded stretch of dirt road, no sign of houses for miles. The lead agent distributed gear, bulletproof vests, radios, maps. A hush fell as the teams confirmed final instructions. Then they advanced, weaving through thick brush until they reached a perimeter fence. It was barbed wire, partly concealed by shrubs. On the other side, they saw glimpses of multiple buildings, some resembling old barns or cabins, others more modern but small. Figures moved between them, though from this distance, it was hard to see who they were. The presence of guards was evident. A couple of men with rifles patrolled the fence line every so often. Ryan's heart thudded. If children were inside, they would be in serious danger if the captors realized a raid was underway. The lead agent signaled for silence. Then, at a coordinated moment, the official assault team battered open the main gate while another team scaled the fence from the north side. Shouts rang out. The patrolling guards scrambled. A flurry of chaos ensued, FBI jackets visible among the trees, voices yelling for suspects to drop their weapons. A few shots were fired. Ryan's stomach clenched at the sound, but the armed men quickly realized they were outmatched. The compound exploded into frantic activity. Cult members darted across courtyards, some trying to hide, others attempting to flee into the forest. The FBI teams pressed in, securing building after building. Ryan stayed close to Naomi, focusing on the possibility that children were locked inside. They found a structure that looked like a schoolhouse. Inside were rows of small desks, outdated textbooks, and bizarre posters spouting paranoia about the outside world. But no children were present. A sense of dread mounted. Where were they? Down a gravel walkway, they spotted a large building with boarded windows. Agents forced the door. Inside was a central hall with multiple rooms branching off. The stench of unwashed bodies and stale air made Ryan gag. As the team swept from room to room, they found children, some as young as 5, some teenagers, huddled in corners, eyes wide with fear. They didn't scream, they just stared, like animals too traumatized to understand rescue. Naomi, voice trembling with empathy, told them, "You're safe now, we're here to help." Some children scurried back anyway, too conditioned to obey the cult's warnings about outsiders. Agents carefully coaxed them out. Suddenly, a swirl of movement in a far room. An older man, who seemed like he might be a cult leader, attempted to hide behind a door, brandishing a shotgun. In the tense moments that followed, FBI agents commanded him to drop his weapon. He hesitated, eyes flashing with fanatic rage. Another shot rang out, but it lodged in the wall. The agents fired back, hitting the man in the shoulder. He dropped with a howl. Naomi rushed forward, disarming him. His eyes were wild. He spat something about the children belonging to the cause, but the agents dragged him away. Ryan joined a pair of agents who burst through another locked door. The room inside was a claustrophobic storage area lined with shelves containing boxes of canned food and supplies. Huddled in the corner was a small figure, a girl with dusty blonde hair, maybe 7 or 8 years old, trembling with eyes large and frightened. Ryan's heart clenched. He approached slowly. "It's okay," he said gently. "We won't hurt you." She shook her head in fear, tears glistening on her cheeks. He set his firearm aside and held out a hand. "My name's Ryan. What's yours?" She barely whispered, "Rosie." The name from the list. Rosie H. Ryan swallowed, relief surging through him. He nodded to the agents, and they let him handle the moment. "Rosie," he said softly, "Ethan told us about you. We're here to help." A flicker of recognition lit her eyes. She whispered, "Ethan's alive?" When Ryan confirmed it with a nod, her tears fell in earnest, though she seemed caught between relief and shock. With gentle coaxing, he managed to lift her to her feet and carry her out. She clung to him like a drowning person to a life raft. Outside, in the courtyard, the FBI was gathering the rescued children and lining up the adult cult members in handcuffs. Some were middle-aged, a few older, all of them with a strange, distant look in their eyes, as though they couldn't quite fathom that their world was collapsing around them. Agents took statements, medics arrived to check on the children, local sheriffs came to assist. It was an enormous operation, but it seemed to be successful. In all, over 20 children were rescued, their names cross-referenced with missing persons from various states. Some had been gone for years. The cult's leaders, a man and a woman who had orchestrated everything, were arrested on multiple charges, including kidnapping and child endangerment. Ryan stayed close to Rosie, who refused to let go of his hand. She was malnourished, scrawny, and covered in bruises, but she was alive, and she was finally free. The news of the raid spread like wildfire through local media outlets. Journalists lined up outside the hospital where the children were taken for medical evaluations. Overnight, Detective Archer and her colleagues found themselves in the national spotlight, praised for uncovering a twisted cult that had operated in secret for years. But while the headlines rolled in, Ryan's concern remained on the children's recovery. He visited them as often as the authorities would allow, including Rosie, who was eventually placed in the same protective foster facility as Ethan. The moment Ethan and Rosie saw each other, Ryan witnessed a reunion that nearly brought him to tears. Ethan rushed forward, calling her name, and Rosie broke into sobs, clinging to him. The two siblings had been separated after the cult leaders decided Ethan was too rebellious. Rosie had believed him dead, told by the captors that if a child failed to follow the rules, they would be taken away. Their tearful embrace was the picture of relief and heartbreak all at once. Over the following weeks, the FBI and local authorities pieced together the horrifying details. Ethan and Rosie had been kidnapped at ages 4 and 6. Their real last name was Calloway. Their parents had died under unrelated circumstances, so no immediate relatives had known about them or followed up on their disappearance. The system had failed them, letting them slip through the cracks. Meanwhile, the the cult had falsified records, declared them dead, and used them in their twisted programs. Similar stories emerged for many of the other rescued children. Some had families desperately searching for them, others had complicated backgrounds that made them easier targets. For Ryan, the desire to protect Ethan and Rosie became an all-consuming focus. He applied to be their foster parent, though the process was complicated. Child Services demanded thorough background checks, psychological evaluations, and home visits. Ryan was determined to see it through. He had never thought of himself as a father figure, but after everything they had endured together, he couldn't imagine leaving them to navigate the system alone. The case against the cult leaders was strong, with the physical evidence from the compound, testimony from multiple children, and reams of twisted lesson plans. Detective Archer worked tirelessly with the DA. Public outcry was immense. The cult members found themselves in front-page news, vilified for brainwashing and mistreating children. Court proceedings dragged on, with the defense trying to claim the children were placed under religious or alternative care, but it was a flimsy argument. Some members even turned on the leaders in exchange for lesser sentences. During this time, Ethan and Rosie slowly adjusted to a semblance of normal life, though normal was a relative term. They both had nightmares, sometimes waking up screaming, convinced they were back in the forest or locked in a basement. Ryan comforted them, promising it was over. He took them to therapy sessions arranged by the foster system. It was clear that their trauma ran deep. Rosie had a habit of flinching whenever someone raised a hand too quickly. Ethan struggled with guilt, feeling like he had abandoned the other children. Over and over, Ryan reassured him that he had done the right thing by escaping and seeking help, that, in fact, he had saved them all. Finally, after months of complicated legal processes, the day came when the children's adoption hearing was scheduled. Ryan walked into the courthouse wearing a simple suit and a determined expression. Ethan and Rosie stood beside him, each holding one of his hands. Rosie wore a pale pink dress that seemed to brighten her face with hope. Ethan had on a collared shirt, stiff and new, clearly not his usual style, but he looked proud. Detective Archer was there too, quietly offering moral support. Inside the wood-paneled courtroom, the judge called the case. With the social worker present, Ryan was questioned about his intentions, his ability to care for two children who had endured significant trauma, and whether he understood the commitment he was making. Ryan answered calmly, sincerely, a note of resolve in his voice. He admitted he had no illusions that it would be easy, but he cared about these two deeply and wouldn't rest until they felt truly safe and loved. When the gavel finally came down, granting Ryan full legal custody and formalizing the adoption process, tears slid down his cheeks. He wasn't alone. Ethan's eyes were wet, though he seemed more stunned than anything, and Rosie clung to Ryan's arm as if afraid someone would snatch her away. The judge offered a small, approving smile. "Congratulations," she said softly. Outside the courthouse, the sun shone bright. Naomi snapped a photo of Ryan standing between Ethan and Rosie, all three of them glowing with a mix of relief and excitement. It was a fresh start for the children, and maybe even for Ryan too. That evening, back at Ryan's modest home, he showed them to their new rooms. He had spent weeks preparing, painting, and decorating with posters of things they liked. Flowers for Rosie, pictures of national parks for Ethan. The boy teased Ryan that he was leaning into the nature theme, but Ryan just laughed, relieved to see Ethan's sense of humor coming back. They shared a simple dinner, spaghetti and meatballs, at a wooden dining table. It was nothing fancy, but it felt momentous, their first meal together as a legal family. Rosie giggled when she tried to twirl noodles on her fork, sauce splattering. Ethan teased her in a big brother way, and Ryan felt his chest tighten with warmth. This, he realized, was what family was supposed to feel like: messy, lively, loving. In the months that followed, Ethan and Rosie continued therapy, overcame nightmares one small step at a time, and discovered the joys of ordinary childhood. Ryan took them to the park, taught them to ride bicycles, and even introduced them to gentle hiking trails to help them conquer their fear of the forest. Gradually, they learned that the woods could also be a place of peace and beauty, not just terror. Sometimes Ethan wanted to talk about what happened, to process it. Ryan listened quietly, reminding him that it was normal to feel anger, sadness, or confusion. Rosie, younger and less verbal about her trauma, clung to stuffed animals for comfort. Slowly they built a routine: school, chores, mealtimes, bedtime stories. Each new day brought tiny victories, from Rosie making a new friend at school, to Ethan laughing over a silly cartoon without that haunted look in his eyes. Although Ryan never forgot the horrors they had faced, he saw how their resilience shone through. They were survivors in the truest sense, and now, with love and support, they could finally blossom. The official trial of the cult leaders concluded with lengthy prison sentences, ensuring they would never hurt a child again. Ryan sat with Ethan and Rosie when the verdict was read on television. Ethan let out a shaky breath, relief mingled with residual fear. Rosie just squeezed Ryan's hand. For them, it was closure, or at least the closest thing to closure they could get. Late one night, after the kids had gone to sleep, Ryan sat out on the front porch with a mug of tea. He looked up at the stars, remembering how it felt to stand beneath a canopy of pines and discover a frightened boy who had lost everything. So much had changed since then. He had not only rescued Ethan. In many ways, Ethan had rescued him from a lonely life with no clear purpose. Now, everything was different. He had a family to protect and love. The next morning, Ryan found Ethan awake early, staring at the forest edge outside the house. The boy turned to Ryan and said, "I feel safe now." The simple statement brought a lump to Ryan's throat. He knew it had taken courage for Ethan to say that after all he'd been through. Ryan put an arm around the boy and guided him back indoors, where Rosie was already rummaging in the kitchen for cereal. Before long, normalcy settled into place. There were still challenges: counseling sessions that stirred up painful memories, fleeting anxieties whenever a stranger visited the house, and the occasional meltdown over small triggers. But they faced them together. In those shared struggles, the bond between Ryan, Ethan, and Rosie grew unshakable. On a balmy summer evening several months later, they gathered on the back porch, eating ice cream cones while the sunset lit the sky in brilliant streaks of orange and pink. Rosie scooted closer to Ryan, tilting her head on his shoulder. Ethan plopped down on the porch step, eyes fixed on the horizon. There was silence for a while, just the soothing sound of crickets and a soft breeze through the grass. Finally, Rosie yawned and said, "I'm tired. Good night." She scampered off to her room. Ryan expected Ethan to follow, but the boy lingered. He glanced at Ryan with a look that combined gratitude and a lingering sadness. "I used to think the forest was the scariest place in the world," he said quietly, "because they used it to punish us. But it's not, is it? It's only scary if someone turns it that way." Ryan nodded, placing a comforting hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Exactly," he said. "It can be scary, or it can be peaceful. It's all about who you're with and what you're doing there." Ethan nodded, then stood up, gave a small smile, and said, "Thanks, Ryan." The implicit meaning behind those words was huge. Thanks for everything. For being there. For not giving up. Ryan just nodded, his chest tight with emotion, and followed Ethan inside. Life for the three of them continued in that rhythm. Rosie joined a local dance class and discovered she loved music. Ethan grew interested in computers, devouring library books about how they worked. Ryan found himself juggling new tasks, like helping with homework and scheduling doctor appointments. But he never once regretted his decision. The house felt alive, no longer just a solitary dwelling with one occupant. The scar left by the cult would never fully vanish, but in time, it became a part of their story rather than the defining feature. And in the community, Ethan and Rosie were welcomed. Neighbors stepped up, offering resources and kindness. People admired Ryan for taking in 2 kids who had endured a nightmare. Yet Ryan always insisted that Ethan and Rosie were the brave ones, the ones who had endured what most adults could barely imagine. On a crisp autumn day, Ryan's phone buzzed with a text from Detective Naomi Archer. She asked how he and the kids were doing, and said she was about to be reassigned to a new city. She wanted to say goodbye properly. A few days later, she came over for dinner, greeting the kids with warm smiles and genuine interest in how they were settling in. Rosie proudly showed off a small trophy from her dance showcase. Ethan told Naomi about the new programming course he had enrolled in. Naomi beamed with pride for them both. Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed, Naomi and Ryan sat on the couch, quietly reflecting on everything that had happened. "You did a good thing," Naomi said softly, sipping her tea. "Sometimes, in my line of work, I wonder if it's possible to make a real difference. Then I see families like yours and I know it is." Ryan smiled wearily. "I never set out to be a dad," he admitted. "But now I can't imagine my life any other way." Naomi nodded. "They're lucky to have you. And we're all lucky you decided to go hiking that morning." They shared a warm silence. Outside, the wind rustled fallen leaves along the driveway. After a bit, Naomi excused herself. She had an early flight. They exchanged a quick hug, and she headed off, leaving Ryan once again alone with his thoughts. He looked around at the small living room, Rosie's school drawings taped to the fridge, Ethan's stack of coding manuals on the coffee table, and realized with a pang of gratitude that the house was no longer just his. It was truly a home. The final legal steps of the adoption process passed without incident. Ryan's last name was officially added to the children's new identification documents, though they both decided to keep Calloway as part of their name, honoring what was lost. And just like that, they settled into a life that felt real and solid. The nightmares receded bit by bit. Laughter became more common. Ethan discovered a knack for cooking, while Rosie dominated any board game she touched. Ryan felt like he was the luckiest man alive. There were, of course, lingering effects. Now and then, a swirling sense of dread would seize Ethan or Rosie. A sudden sound outside the house might trigger fear. But Ryan's door was always open for them, literally and figuratively. They knew they could creep into his room at night if they needed reassurance. Often, Rosie curled up with a blanket at the foot of his bed, while Ethan would sit by the window, looking out at the moonlit yard, remembering nights far darker in that cult's grip. Sometimes, Ryan would join Ethan, gazing at the moon with him. He'd remind the boy that everything around them was part of a world they could explore freely now, not a prison. The forest was just a forest, and no shadows lurked with malice unless people brought that malice with them. Ethan would nod, gradually letting each wave of tension pass. As the seasons turned, the family of three marked the anniversaries of important moments. The day Ryan found Ethan. The day the cult compound was raided. The day Ethan and Rosie left the hospital for the last time. The day the adoption was finalized. Each milestone was celebrated quietly, with small gestures, maybe a special dinner, or a heartfelt conversation before bed. At these times, Ethan often wore a faint, reflective smile. Rosie would climb into Ryan's lap, hugging him. They never forgot how close they came to losing everything. One brisk winter afternoon, a local journalist who had covered the cult case reached out to Ryan for an update, maybe a heartwarming piece about resilience. Ryan politely declined. He recognized the desire for a good story, but he wanted to protect Ethan and Rosie's privacy, to let them move on without constant public reminders. The journalist understood, or at least respected the refusal. Ryan told Ethan about it, and the boy looked relieved. He said he preferred to share his story when he was older, on his own terms. When spring arrived, the nightmares had decreased significantly, and both children seemed more at ease in everyday life. Rosie joined a Girl Scouts troop. Ethan started talking about volunteering at the local animal shelter. Ryan wholeheartedly supported them, proud of how far they had come. He drove them to their activities, listened to their excited chatter on the ride home, took them out for ice cream to celebrate small achievements. One day, after a particularly good session with the therapist, Ethan surprised Ryan by suggesting a camping trip. "We could go back to the forest," he said cautiously, "but somewhere safe and official, like a real campground. Would that be okay?" Ryan paused, carefully gauging Ethan's tone. "If you're ready, of course," he said, warmth in his voice. "We'll pick a place that's got good facilities, maybe near a ranger station, and you can leave any time you want." Ethan nodded, looking both nervous and determined. "I want to see it in a different way," he explained, "without being scared." And so, they planned a weekend trip. Rosie was eager, though a little uneasy, but she followed her brother's lead. They chose a popular campground near the edge of the park, far from the haunted corners where Ethan had been found, and not too isolated. They pitched tents near a tranquil lake. The first night, they roasted marshmallows over a small fire, telling silly stories. Rosie marveled at the stars overhead, bright and shimmering. Ethan, though quiet, seemed contemplative rather than terrified. Ryan sat between them, feeling the gentle night breeze and smiling at how far they'd come. That night, they slept in one big tent, Ethan and Rosie on either side of Ryan. At some point, Ryan woke to see Ethan gazing at him in the dim glow of a lantern. "Everything okay?" Ryan murmured. Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah. I was just remembering the first night we camped together, how scared I was." He took a breath. "But this time I'm not scared. It feels good." Ryan ruffled the boy's hair affectionately. "I'm proud of you," he said. "Both of you." Ethan gave him a small grin, then tucked himself back into the sleeping bag, soon drifting off to the gentle sounds of wind in the trees. Rosie snored softly on Ryan's other side, hugging a stuffed bunny. When morning came, they woke to golden sunlight over the water and the cheerful chorus of birds. They hiked an easy trail, stopping to watch chipmunks scurry along the rocks. Rosie squealed when she spotted a deer drinking at the lake's edge. The children's delight reminded Ryan of how wondrous nature could be when not twisted by malevolent forces. Here, under the bright sky, it was a place of healing. Though the memories of the cult still haunted them occasionally, the healing had undeniably begun in earnest. By the final day of the camping trip, Ethan told Ryan he wanted to do this more often, maybe even learn some of Ryan's survival skills when he felt ready. Ryan agreed wholeheartedly, ensuring Ethan understood they would only take slow, careful steps. Rosie said she preferred a cabin in the woods approach, maybe with running water and a proper bed. Ryan laughed, promising to find a compromise. That was how they shaped their new life, forging fresh memories in places that once terrified them, reclaiming the forest, discovering the beauty of being a family. Whenever the ghost of the past threatened to resurface, they reminded each other of the present reality. They were free. They were safe. They were loved. In the final sense, justice was served. The cult leaders received lengthy sentences, ensuring they wouldn't see freedom again for decades, if ever. The rescued children, with proper counseling and supportive families, began to heal. Some were reunited with their birth families, if they still existed. Others found adoptive homes like Ethan and Rosie. The foster system, riddled with flaws, still managed to bring them hope and a chance at real childhood. As for Ryan, he no longer considered himself just a backpacker or a survivalist. He was now a father, and that role became central to who he was. No longer did he wander aimlessly from park to park, chasing the solitude of wilderness. Now, each step was guided by the thought of the children waiting at home, two resilient souls who had reshaped his life in ways he never anticipated. Sometimes, he thought back to that morning under the pine canopy, hearing that muffled sob and stumbling upon Ethan. It was almost like fate had led him there, or maybe it was just coincidence. Either way, it had changed the course of countless lives, shining a light on something awful and setting in motion a series of events that led to rescue and redemption. Ethan and Rosie rarely spoke of the cult by name. They simply called it the bad place, if they talked about it at all. Over time, that place faded further into memory, overshadowed by new experiences and the unwavering support of their adoptive father. Ryan would drive them to school each morning, teasing them about tests or homework. In the afternoons, he'd help them with projects, praising them for their perseverance. On weekends, the three ventured to museums, playgrounds, or big fields where Rosie could cartwheel to her heart's content, and Ethan could fling a frisbee without a second thought about who might be watching from the shadows. Every night, they returned to a warm home full of trust and comfort. It wasn't perfect. Trauma leaves invisible scars that take years to mend, but it was genuine. It was proof that good things could arise from even the darkest horrors. On a winter evening more than a year after the raid, Ryan found himself sitting in the living room, reading a storybook to Rosie while Ethan fiddled with a puzzle at the table. The glow of the lamp cast a soft circle of light. Outside, snow drifted gently, blanketing the yard. Rosie's eyelids drooped, so Ryan paused reading and scooped her into his arms. She murmured something about stars and drifted to sleep on his shoulder. He carried her to her room, tucking her in beneath warm blankets. When he returned, he saw Ethan standing by the window, gazing out at the snowfall. "Do you think?" Ethan started, then trailed off. Ryan approached softly. "What's on your mind?" Ethan took a moment to answer. "Just wondering about the other kids," he said. "From the compound. If they're okay." Ryan nodded, placing a hand gently on Ethan's back. "Most of them, as far as I know, were placed with good families or relatives. They're probably watching the snow, too, or maybe playing video games. They're healing just like you are." Ethan exhaled, as if letting go of a burden. "That's good," he whispered. Ryan could see the glimmer of relief in the boy's eyes. He smiled. "Come on," he said, "let's get you to bed. Another big day tomorrow. You're working at the animal shelter, right?" Ethan grinned. "Yeah. I can't wait to see the dogs again." Ryan tousled his hair. "You've got a big heart, kiddo." That night, as Ethan fell asleep, Ryan lingered in the doorway. He remembered the terrified child he'd first encountered in that lonely stretch of forest. Now, a quiet peace rested on Ethan's face. Ryan shut off the light, leaving only a faint nightlight on, a small beacon against the darkness. Eventually, after a final check on Rosie, Ryan made his way to his own room. He had a small desk in the corner, with a laptop open. The screensaver displayed a photo from the adoption day. Ryan standing with Ethan and Rosie outside the courthouse, all smiles. Sometimes, he'd stare at that picture and marvel at how different life had become. He clicked the laptop shut. The hour was late, but sleep would come easily now. Tomorrow they had more living to do, more everyday miracles, more steps toward wholeness. Before turning off the lamp, Ryan whispered to the silent room, "Thank you," though he wasn't sure whom he was thanking, maybe fate, maybe the forest, maybe his own lucky stars. All he knew was that the nightmare was over, and a better future had finally begun. Thanks for watching this story unfold. If you believe the truth should always come to light, remember to give this a like and subscribe for more tales of courage and resilience. We appreciate you being here. Take care, and we'll see you next time.